Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to the second half of the lecture. And this is again the last lecture of new material we'll be having. And so we'll close on sort of a, well, what about Antarctica today? Look at the continent. I wanted to mention that this is a schematic of actually one of the parts of the newer and more technologically advanced Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. And for example, they allude to the fact that the station has more windows now, and that the building's foundation is actually heavier than the building itself in order to keep it anchored. So currently, Antarctica is still used by scientists for research. It has, in many ways, been in many ways, it's been isolated from the rest of the world. The climate change causing activities aren't occurring on the continent. Burning of fossil fuels isn't occurring there. In many ways, even the COVID pandemic passed Antarctica by. There were maybe a handful of cases on the continent, but very few overall and very heavily screened. But as we talked about during the climate change unit, Antarctica is not completely isolated from human activities. It's being affected by climate change, and there are lingering questions over what might happen to Antarctica if, say, the treaty were to lapse. And part of this last part of the lecture, we'll be talking about what human activity does occur in Antarctica in addition to science, what tourism occurs, what limited economic activity occurs in the waters around Antarctica, and what possibly could happen in Antarctica if the treaty were to lapse. So one thing I want to talk about is that there are two terms that are used interchangeably when talking about taking care of the environment, and those are conservation and preservation. And preservation has a goal of leaving things as intact or untouched by humanity as possible, while conservation is achieving a healthy ecosystem while leaving room for sustainable use of natural resources by humans. And in many cases, conservation is a more desirable outcome, especially if we want humans to modify their behavior. The idea behind conservation is that society can use nature responsibly to some degree, but really needs to adjust to the degree to which it does so, and it's up in the air. It's questionable to what degree society can actually do that in a system where there's a lot of pressure to make money. Conservation does also have advantages in situations where Indigenous people are involved, because Indigenous people used natural resources for many years, and simply being like, oh, people can't use this at all is something they don't take well to for good reason. And so that relates to, for example, traditional methods of hunting, traditional methods of plant gathering. That does not really apply to Antarctica because there are no Indigenous people in Antarctica. And so the framework put in place by the Antarctic Treaty System has leaned more heavily towards preservation than conservation. But there is some activity that goes on in Antarctica, some economic activity, even though certain economic activities like extracting fossil fuels or mining are completely banned. And again, to what extent any economic activity can be sustainable is an open question, and it's an open question whether Antarctica can be used at all for human activities like fishing without environmental degradation. So Antarctica, while not completely isolated from humanity, is rigorously protected from environmental devastation, and in general, that has been enforced and respected. Humans have a smaller footprint in Antarctica than they do in most other places, but no human activity leaves no footprint whatsoever, and even the presence of well-meaning scientists is going to have some impact. When I was there, for example, we had to document where our helicopter had landed and how long we had been at different camps, and even how many tubs of human waste we had generated while at each camp. And this was all done as part of an impact report. And I mentioned impact as in humans being present in Antarctica is going to have some impact, whether that seems small or not. And we had to document everything we did there. In part, this was done so that if future researchers were done in the dry valleys, other researchers on other projects might consider using different locations for camps so that the particular locations we used would not be overused. Of course, also, if tourists and people fishing are present, they're going to have an impact too. And the number of tourists who can come to Antarctica is limited. The treaty is also meant to enforce fishing limits, including the number of boats that can be present in Antarctic waters. One example of how just humans being there leaves an effect is microplastics. And so outside of Dr. Bronner's and some other brands of shampoo and soap that are completely natural and don't have any plastics in them, and you'll notice those tend to foam less. Pretty much all shampoo, soaps, and a lot of bathroom products have microplastic beads in them. These tiny bits of plastic function to exfoliate and to help foam. And these tiny bits of plastic are not filtered out by water treatment plants. So these plastic beads, these microplastics, have been detected in the water in increasing numbers around Antarctica. And the long-term impact of this is not well understood, but in general, plastic in the water is not a good thing, as I alluded to previously with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And so the scientists, the people at McMurdo, for example, have responded by banning conventional bathroom products and requiring people to use microbead-free products. Comparatively, though, most pollution that could affect Antarctica is pollution coming from elsewhere that still makes its way to Antarctica. Like when we think about CFCs, chlorinated fluorocarbons from aerosol cans reaching Antarctica and causing ozone depletion, or increased carbon dioxide and methane emissions in the global atmosphere causing melting of ice shelves and warming of seawater in Antarctica. It's relatively easy to deal with the pollution from the tiny human population in Antarctica, but it's harder to do anything directly about CFCs without tackling the global problem or to deal with increased carbon dioxide emissions without tackling climate change on a global scale. Antarctica has something resembling national parks. Under the Antarctic Treaty System, there are some areas that have especially strict regulations, and these are known as Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, or ASPAs. And permission is needed to enter these areas, as well as to collect samples and conduct scientific operations. And in many cases, activities like even flying over these ASPAs are heavily regulated. So places they might designate as an ASPA are areas that have historical artifacts, where there are huts or boats or relics of earlier explorers, or places where you have unusual organisms, extremophiles like those that live at Blood Falls, or places that have natural features like soil crusts or ice features or ventifacts that can be easily damaged. So Blood Falls, which I mentioned, is a really good example of an ASPA. The protocol for Blood Falls says that you can fly over without a permit and you can be on the surface of the glacier that covers it. But if you're going to either enter or send probes to the under ice area, then you need a special permit. And for those scientists working on Blood Falls who hope to collect samples or send probes in, they have to clearly state why the research needs to be done and why it has to be done here in particular. And nowadays, more than ever, Antarctic research has to pass the "why does this have to be done in Antarctica?" test for it to be justified. And it involves a lot of paperwork. My field area was technically in an ASPA because the dry valleys are heavily protected also. I didn't require quite as much paperwork as this, but we needed paperwork to be allowed to take samples and to camp there for extended periods, as well as to fly helicopters. So some economic activity does occur in Antarctica, largely related to fishing. And according to the Antarctic Treaty, nothing in the treaty shall affect the rights of any state with regards to the high seas. In other words, the treaty doesn't specifically control fishing in Antarctic waters, which are considered to be high seas that don't belong to any nation. But international waters aren't a free-for-all, and there have been a number of subsequent amendments to the treaty under the Antarctic Treaty System that have put fishing quotas in place in an effort to curb overfishing. Meanwhile, various fossil fuels are known to exist in Antarctica or speculated to exist based on rock type or other evidence. The treaty explicitly bans mining, however, and so no present extraction is occurring in Antarctica. Coal exists in Antarctica, as well as oil. It's not clear how much oil is in Antarctica or the surrounding waters, but one published estimate indicates that at least 200 billion barrels of oil could be on the continent. And that is comparable to the reserves in Saudi Arabia. Of course, extraction is completely banned under the treaty, at least until 2048, and it is also seen as being prohibitively expensive to extract oil from Antarctica right now. But you still have lingering uneasy questions about how desperate the world is going to be for fossil fuels by 2048 and what political forces will be at work. And presently, oil is being extracted from the Falkland Islands, from the waters surrounding the Falkland Islands, where there are several oil fields. These islands, remember, are controlled by the United Kingdom, but they are also claimed by Argentina to this day. And the oil was a driving factor in the war that broke out between Argentina and the UK in the 1980s. And there is a good chance that there is oil farther south in the part of the Southern Ocean covered by the treaty. Oil extraction in the Southern Ocean would, of course, run the risk of there being oil spills, particularly with how windy and stormy the Southern Ocean is. That could cause easy damage to oil rigs, and that could mean oil affecting seal and whale and penguin populations in an area that's rather remote and might be potentially difficult to deploy a cleanup force to. As for coal, remember that we learned that coal formed during the Carboniferous and early Permian, and from the swamps that covered Antarctica and much of the rest of the world. And coal is known from the Transantarctic Mountains. It would also be prohibitively expensive to access, and it's also banned. Oops, pardon me. But anyway, coal in Antarctica can also not be extracted, but again, who knows precisely what state the world is going to be in 2048. As for other minerals, to what extent they're present in Antarctica is largely speculative. There's a specific amendment to the treaty called the Madrid Protocol that bans all activities related to mining that aren't explicitly scientific. So my advisor and I got permits to remove several tons of rock, none of which had any economically valuable minerals of note. We were able to take these tons of rock, though, to study them at UCSB to put in a paper, but a mining company would not be allowed to do this. And it's really not clear how rich in minerals Antarctica actually is, and a lot of rocks that could bear minerals are covered in ice, so it's kind of everybody's guess as to how rich in minerals Antarctica actually is. Western Australia is very rich in minerals, and remember that Western Australia and Australia in general share a geologic history with East Antarctica. The two continents were attached until the Oligocene, very recently speaking geologically. But the southernmost tip of Western Australia, which is the part that would have been connected to Antarctica, doesn't have quite as many minerals, and so it's not clear as to what extent the formerly connected part of Antarctica has these same minerals. Chromium is one mineral that is suggested to be present in East Antarctica because of this. Similarly, in South America, which was also quite recently attached to Antarctica, you have a lot of copper, and so some geologists have proposed that you might have a lot of copper in the Antarctic Peninsula, but they have not found any deposits just yet. Iron ore is also known to be common in Antarctica because the glacial debris that comes out of the East Antarctic ice sheet has a lot of iron ore. But it's clearly mostly under the ice, which would require dangerous and destructive techniques to get any of it. We don't really want to be blowing glaciers up to get minerals, is the bottom line. As for fishing, so fishing in Antarctica has the same problems that fisheries elsewhere face from over-extraction. So the conservation of Antarctica marine living resources is part of the Antarctic Treaty System, and it applies to all waters south of the Antarctic convergence, rather than any areas south of a particular latitude. Remember that the convergence is often considered to be the northern boundary of the Antarctic region. It's the front where polar and temperate waters come into contact. And this amendment to the treaty system sets conservation standards and sustainable use limits for krill Antarctic toothfish, and other species. But it doesn't directly address whaling or sealing. And this is one example of how protecting a single area can only go so far, because the waters north of the Antarctic convergence have become very heavily overfished. This has led fishing crews that were formerly based south of Australia or New Zealand or southern Africa or South America to start delving farther south into Antarctic waters and to begin fishing there. Some of this has been illegal. For example, the Patagonian toothfish, which largely lives north of the convergence, is a commonly fished species that has been declining. So fishermen have headed south to hunt the similar Antarctic toothfish. Some of this has been legal, some of it has not. And illegal fishing is taking place on top of the set quotas, and enforcement hasn't always been consistent. And this has led to concerns that Antarctic toothfish will be overfished and that the quotas need to be set lower to take illegal fishing into account, which has made some people angry and led to tensions over to what degree this should be regulated. And toothfish fishing really ramped up after 1996, and that has led to a drop in Antarctic toothfish populations, which is concerning. For example, hundreds of toothfish used to be caught at McMurdo Base every year, but because of overfishing, they don't get as many as 100 when they do the surveys every year now. In 2007, they caught exactly 2 Antarctic toothfish at McMurdo compared to several hundred a decade ago. And the takeaway is that as long as the fish stocks around Antarctica remain overfished, Antarctica's marine life will be at risk. And global conservation of fisheries needs to happen on a broader and more systematic scale. Protecting just one area isn't necessarily enough. Speaking of whaling, some whaling does still continue in Antarctica. Recognizing the need to do something about the near disappearance of many species, particularly the baleen whales, the International Whaling Commission was established in 1946, and the purpose was to conserve whale stocks and develop an orderly whaling industry. In other words, the Whaling Commission wasn't set aside for preservation or to save all of the whales. But recently, it has served that purpose a bit more closely because in 1986, recognizing that whale populations needed time to recover, the IWC declared a commercial moratorium on whaling, and so no commercial whaling is allowed. But a small number of countries have continued to whale for scientific purposes, which has been controversial. Japan's whaling program has been especially controversial, in part because it appears to have ramped up in recent years. And Japan hunts minke whales under an exception for research, but whale meat has been documented as being sold to wholesalers for the public to eat. And that raises questions about how much of this is really for science. The government in Japan has asserted that its research is justified and that eating whale meat is a Japanese tradition. That is apparently only really true for a few small whaling communities on some of the outlying islands. Whale meat was eaten as a starvation food in the wake of World War II due to food shortages. And some Japanese activists who are opposed to whaling consider that to be an invented tradition and criticize the government for that. So in spite of international opposition, a lot of bad publicity, and the fact that there's plenty of domestic opposition to this as well, the Japanese government has continued this practice. And there's a lot of concern over what this is going to do to these whale populations, especially since it appears to be especially since they've been catching more and more in recent years. Now, in terms of economic activities, another important one is tourism. And that's the main economic activity in Antarctica outside of fishing. A lot of cruise ships go to Antarctica, and cruise ships visit the subantarctic islands. They'll stop at South Georgia to see the whaling station and Shackleton's grave, and then they'll peruse the Antarctic waters for sightseeing and for whale watching. Occasionally, groups of tourists for a lot of money will be allowed to embark at Palmer or McMurdo to sightsee and buy souvenirs at the gift shop. Tourism does have the potential to promote environmental awareness and to provide revenue for poor countries, although a lot of the ships sent to Antarctica have been sent by more developed nations. But there are plenty of risks. Tourists in general are going to get less training and background information on how to be in Antarctica responsibly than scientists are. And this increases the risk of damage to wildlife and natural features. And there's also the risk of pollution, both from the ships and from individual carelessness, like just people dropping or losing garbage. Some people really have started to question just how accessible Antarctica should be for people, especially people who haven't had specialized training. One thing is that tourism has declined since the 2008 recession. And since 2008, there have been fewer people visiting Antarctica. There was also a ban on heavy fuels enacted out of concern for contamination, and that's reduced the number of ships that can come. The treaty doesn't say anything about tourists, but it is legally binding for anybody who comes to Antarctica. And I think that fact needs to be made much more clear to anybody who considers coming down to Antarctica. The treaty applies to you. You have to be careful how you behave in Antarctica, and human activities are not really the norm there. Human activities are an exception, and how you behave in Antarctica matters a lot. So the treaty was by and large designed to avert geopolitical conflicts, and a full-scale war has never occurred in Antarctica. The treaty was drawn up to prevent this. But in areas north of the treaty, there have been a number of incidents, and this sort of foretells what could happen if the treaty were to lapse, or if enforcement completely ceased. For example, in 1979, the Vela satellite detected a double flash in the South Indian Ocean, and double flashes are characteristic of atomic explosions. The flash occurred on Prince Edward Island, which I briefly talked about during the geography section. It's an uninhabited island controlled by South Africa, between Africa and Antarctica. And it's now believed that the apartheid-era government of South Africa was conducting a nuclear test. The island isn't covered under the treaty. The treaty bans nuclear testing, but this island isn't technically covered under the treaty, so there was nothing necessarily stopping South Africa from testing a bomb there. The government of South Africa later suspended its nuclear program. It's actually known to be the only country that had nuclear weapons and later got rid of them. Probably the most prominent conflict was the Falklands War, and this occurred during the 1980s. The Falklands are known as the Islas Malvinas in Argentina, and they have been a source of contention between the UK and Argentina for years. The Falklands were variously claimed by Britain and by Spain and France. As whaling and sealing brought more people to the Southern Ocean, the Falklands never had an indigenous population, actually. Argentina became independent from Spain during the Napoleonic Wars and claimed the Falkland Islands immediately and sent a group of settlers. But the British drove them off in the 1830s, and settled their own people and claimed the islands as their own. So the present-day population of the Falkland Islands consists of a few thousand English-speaking people, mostly of European descent, who are citizens of the UK. But Argentina has continued to claim the islands, and they maintain that the islands were illegally occupied, and that has been something that they've pushed now that oil is known to exist in the water outside of the Falklands. Argentina was controlled by military dictatorships for a lot of the 20th century, and these administrations took a harder line against British influence. In 1982, Leopoldo Galtieri, who was the president at the time, ordered an invasion and took Stanley, the capital of the islands, and also occupied South Georgia, claiming that territory as well. The conservative British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher ordered a counterattack, and she was very happy to use this as a way to rally support for herself and for her government. Galtieri didn't really have an easy time rallying any sort of popular support. The army and the dictatorship were unpopular, and the islands were far from the mainland, not inhabited by Argentinians, and something that the average Argentinian people didn't really think about all that much. Margaret Thatcher had an easier time drumming up enthusiasm for the Falklands War among her supporters. So Argentina had a hard time holding the islands, and after just a few months, Argentina had surrendered control back to the UK. Tensions between the two countries are still high, and Argentina continues to claim the Falkland Islands, but it's not seen as likely that they would actually try to occupy them at this point. So the Falklands are not governed under the treaty. And again, there's the potential for wars to break out over conflicting territorial claims and natural resources in Antarctica if the treaty were to lapse. The very last thing I want to talk about is just a little bit about media representation of Antarctica, because it's ever since, both before and after the existence of it was confirmed, it's appeared as this mythical place. And it's often been shown with properties very much unlike the actual continent, both before its existence was confirmed and after. It's also served as the basis for adventure stories, and that's gone on even long after the heroic age. I also come across a lot of stories where Antarctica is kind of this blank slate or tabula rasa, where all sorts of fantastical things can be put. And that's kind of what, if you think about it, what people were doing when they imagined this mysterious terra incognita australis before anybody knew what was actually there. So, for example, in the comic Watchmen, Ozymandias has his hideaway there. He has a pleasure dome of sorts that keeps the cold out and has advanced technology. I've alluded to one Japanese anime about Antarctic exploration called A Place Further Than the Universe. I came across another one about Antarctica that had a really strange Antarctic connection. In this series, known as A Centaur's Life, in which the world is inhabited by satyrs and mermaids and centaurs instead of people, Antarctica is home to a race of sentient snake people, one of whom comes to Japan as an exchange student. I'm assuming they must have been warm-blooded, but this is what I mean when I say that there's a lot of stories that just sort of put all sorts of weird stuff in Antarctica. Like I mentioned briefly earlier, there have been conspiracy theories about aliens in Antarctica, Hitler having a base there, Superman's base is in the Arctic, but similar idea. In terms of novels that have been written about Antarctica, Edgar Allan Poe, who is most famous for his poems and his short stories like The Raven and Annabel Lee and The Telltale Heart. His one complete full-length novel is called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's set aboard a whaling vessel. It's an adventure story, but a very densely written one. And the book ends on a cliffhanger where the main character is trapped in Antarctica. Jules Verne really liked this story. He's the same person who wrote Around the World in 80 Days and The Mysterious Island and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He wrote a sequel to this called An Antarctic Mystery. So it's one of a rare case. So it's basically fan fiction. People act like fan fiction is a recent thing, but nope, Jules Verne totally wrote some Edgar Allan Poe fan fiction. Poe's novel was really racist. It depicts Black people in really racist, caricatured ways. It shows the subantarctic islands as being full of really badly portrayed dark-skinned natives who, A, didn't actually live there, B, it's clearly like knocking Black people down a fair bit. And more recently, Matt Johnson, who himself is Black, satirized this and the whiteness of Antarctic exploration and of explorer narratives in general with his own novel, Pym, which is more of a ironic and critical look at the colonial and imperial elements of polar exploration. So I find that kind of interesting how there's been this narrative, how there's been this thread of novels initially written by Edgar Allan Poe, but there's been several follow-up novels to that that have sort of examined its legacy and the legacy of Antarctic exploration in general. And that, folks, is about the end of the course. That is all the new material for this quarter, and we will start review and preparations for the final exam on Wednesday, May 26th, with Lecture 18, which is a review of the pre-midterm material. So I'll talk about I'll review the pre-midterm material and focus on what is likely to show up on the final, as well as connections with the pre-midterm material and material that we've had since then. I will be recording this live during office hours at 2 o'clock on the 26th, and that will be during regular office hours again, starting at 2. So I hope to see some of you then, and take care.